Britain and America have a lot in common. They share a language, share much of their history, and in many ways share a culture. What they don't share is a completely like-for-like political scene. There are some similarities. The American system was actually based off of the UK's, but since the Constitution was written, both systems have evolved to make for some important contrasts. The most glaring of which is that the states elect a president, while the Brits have a monarchy. It's pretty tempting to say on a knee-jerk reaction that makes America a better democracy than Britain. But a monarchy does have some advantages. A politically neutral head of state can be praised and respected without having to imply respect to a political agenda. There was a bit of an outcry a few years ago when someone shouted, "You lie," at Obama while he spoke to Congress about healthcare. It's a rather odd scene where politicians have to sit in respectful silence listening to an idea they oppose. British politicians have to do this whenever the Queen opens Parliament, but it's not her implementing the policies, and she speaks completely neutrally, so that implies respect to the Queen, with no implication they support the policies. Really though, the monarch and the president are far from perfect equivalents. The president is both the head of state and the head of government, while the monarch is only the head of state. The British government is headed by a Prime Minister. The president really has much more in common with this Prime Minister than the monarch. But there are some crucial differences. A president isn't a part of the legislature, while the Prime Minister is. The Prime Minister sits in the House of Commons, an equivalent to the US House of Representatives. In a sense, the British Prime Minister is the President and the Majority Leader rolled into one. Since the British Upper House, the House of Lords, is much weaker than the US Senate, in fact it can be completely overruled, the Prime Minister effectively controls the legislature. This stands in very stark contrast to the President. Despite him being in charge, the UK doesn't directly elect the Prime Minister. So that's both the head of state and the head of government we don't get to elect. So perhaps we should score 2 to American democracy. Instead of a direct election to decide the Prime Minister, he is determined simply by whoever can control the House of Commons. What this nearly always means is the Prime Minister is the leader of the party with a majority of the MPs. So via our definition, the US Prime Minister would currently be a Republican. Americans may find it surprising to learn that a British Prime Minister can resign and hand over power to someone else, with only his political party required to agree. Because the British system directly ties the executive branch to the legislative branch, a lot of Brits don't even realise there's a difference between the two. It means they often don't understand how the American system works. For a law to pass in the UK, the government comes up with an idea, shoves it through the House of Commons via their majority, sends it off to the Lords where it can at best be slowed down, and then they make the Queen sign it into law. The only way to prevent an executive-backed bill from happening is either to slow it down in the Lords so much that the government drops the issue to make way for something more important, or for members of the government's own party to rebel against them. The former way only works if the government doesn't care much for the bill anyway, and the latter is hugely controversial and normally quite rare. Essentially, the executive can normally get any law it backs passed. In the few examples where it fails, it typically signals the end for a Prime Minister, or even the entire government. For something to pass into law in the States, however, a bill needs the approval of both the Senate and the House, and if it only passes by a small majority, it needs the President's approval too. If the Congress overwhelmingly back a law, it becomes veto-proof, and the President no longer has to approve. America rarely lets both the Congress and the President belong to the same party. In fact, they normally set the two completely at odds with one another, with both houses of Congress controlled by the other party from the President. In Britain, this would be the same as David Cameron remaining the Prime Minister while Labour gain a majority of seats. The British should wonder how this could possibly function, and the American system functions very differently from the British as a result, when it even functions at all. When the Brits vote, the ballot paper only gives them the name of the candidates for their local MP, and not the name of the party leaders trying to become Prime Minister. So theoretically, they're just choosing their local representative. In reality, Brits will vote to back a political party and its leader, and the MP candidate is only voted for through extension. Their vote is determined by a mixture of who they want for Prime Minister and their own party loyalties. Americans get to choose their local representatives separately from the President. This gives them more democratic choice than the Brits, in some ways. But in other ways, Brits actually have more options open to them than the States. When Americans elect their President, whoever wins, wins. As long as they get 270 electors in the Electoral College, they're President. If they win all 538 electors, they're President. There's no increase in power. But the power of the British Prime Minister is proportional to his success. Right now, David Cameron leads the Conservative Party as the largest party in the Commons, but he failed to win an outright majority in the last election. This is what is meant by a hung parliament. So he has to work in a coalition to get his laws through. A coalition of Liberals and Conservatives both need to back any law to get them passed. This is basically the same situation that US presidents nearly always find themselves in. In 1997, something completely different happened. The British voted in Tony Blair on a landslide. With a huge number of Labour MPs backing him, Blair could pass almost anything into law. He was close enough to an elected dictator. It wasn't for 8 years, after a third election which saw the now unpopular Blair's majority shrink, that a rebellion finally blocked some proposed legislation. So the British public can do something the American public can't, which is determine the power of the executive. It should be noted that this is a power the electorate only has as a collective entity. There's no hung parliament option on the ballot paper. There are some other key differences between the President and the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is the leader of his party, while the President only represents his. The President has term limits, while Prime Ministers can go on and on until they either lose an election, resign, get backstabbed by their own party, or die. As to the question of what's better, well, that's tricky. The Prime Minister can certainly get more laws passed than the President can, but some may say that's a bad thing because they don't want such a powerful government. Democratic accountability may be a good measure for comparing two countries, but who's got more accountability, the States or the UK, is hard to say. There's no direct election for Prime Minister, but he does have something a President doesn't, which is a clearly laid out manifesto. Some people aren't happy with Obama right now because he didn't do all the stuff they wanted him to do. This could just be because his 2008 election campaign was pretty bloody vague. Change what exactly? Or it could be that he's doing his best and continually forward because the Congress system is too slow and awkward for Obama to do what he wanted to do. Or perhaps he just straight out lied and took you all for a ride. There's no real way to tell. When they elect a president, they don't really know what policies they're going to get, and even when, 4 years later, it was never what they hoped it would be, they don't know what to blame. The British Prime Minister publishes a book with his party of all the things he wants to do, and since it's so much easier to pass laws, the British can generally expect those policies to actually happen. If they award a Prime Minister a majority, and the policies they backed still don't happen, they know they've been duped. Of course, this could all just be cultural. Both peoples will be happier with whatever system they're more used to. Then again, some Brits want to change their system to be more like the American version. But Congress and presidential approval ratings are very low in the States. Maybe Americans should ask themselves, do they want to change the people in the system or change the system itself? If they do wish to change the system itself, then they have to do something else first, which is to concede that their constitution is a flawed document, something which Americans seem loath to do.